lot of the regulatory guidance is to not confuse the consumer, right? And to be non-misleading and to be fair in comparisons or enable them to be empowered. And so I would hope that if we do create some type of standardized system like this, that could be used so that if you see something that says it's mid, moderate, or high, whatever nutrient you want to be mid or high, that we all know what that means.
Welcome to the Pet Food Science Podcast, powered by Wisenetics, your trusted source for the cutting-edge science and insights driving the global pet food industry forward. Whether you're a nutritionist, product developer, marketer, veterinarian, or decision maker in the pet food space, this podcast is your go-to for staying competitive and informed. From emerging research and regulatory shifts to ingredient innovation and sustainability trends, we cover what matters. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Shoveler. I'm a professor of companion animal nutrition at the University of Guelph. I have a background in comparative animal nutrition and 2 decades of experience working alongside industry partners. Let's dive in today's episodes and explore why setting and using standards in veterinary nutrition is warranted and can be helpful. On today's podcast, we have Dr. Sean Delaney, founder of Davis Veterinary Medical Consulting Incorporated, which is a California benefit corporation and certified B Corp. Dr. Delaney supports their 2 brands, Balance IT and vetnutritionist.AI. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks, Kate, for having me on. Looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, very excited to hear about your new tool. I love metrics and I love tools and models, and I'm excited about you describing all those to the audience today. So maybe what we should do first is because I believe this is your first time on the Pet Food Science Podcast.
It is.
Yeah, let's introduce yourself. You have a very interesting history in pet nutrition.
Yeah, so I'm kind of got academic, industry, private practice, entrepreneurial experience. And so I was at UC Davis as a student, then as a resident, then as a faculty member, did a little hiatus and ran R&D for a company that got acquired by Procter & Gamble. Have done a lot of industry consulting for small and big companies in a variety of ways. Had done some self-governance in the veterinary world, so I have some experience running my specialty college for our board-certified veterinarians and also all of our specialists. I was the head of for a while in North America through the AVMA, trained residents, both in academia and private practice, make formulation software, and written a textbook that's used widely by my colleagues. So had kind of a nice industry, academic, varied experience. And it's really been a pleasure. And I'm really thankful to my mentors that got me to where I am.
Oh, well, you have to tell us a little bit about your mentors then, because that's also a very important component, especially to trainees.
Yeah, so I was really fortunate when I was training at Davis that Jim Morris, who's still around, and see him in his 90s, and Quentin Rogers, who's moved away, so I don't see him much anymore, took me under their wing when I was a vet student. I ended up doing a master's at the same time as vet school, did a summer project, and they were cat nutritionists, not veterinarians, but they're honorary diplomats into my specialty for all their contributions. They're on the NRC committee, did a lot of amino acid work on the part of Quentin Rogers. And then Jim did a lot of work on vitamins, especially, and some minerals, and a lot of great PhD students and veterinary nutritionists have come out of that group over the years. But anyway, they took me under wing, and I then got trained in my specialty as a nutritionist by Andrea Fassetti, who's also a board nutritionist, and I'm really thankful. And of course, your students, your residents, they teach you a lot too. So I consider that part of it.
Absolutely. That's when your job changes, you need the students to keep you up to date with all the most breaking science out there that you don't have the same amount of time to do. So I completely agree with you.
And they ask hard questions for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Especially graduate students and are quite curious usually. So lots and lots of questions, which is fantastic.
Yes.
Feed formulation software is stuck in the past. Most tools haven't evolved beyond basic least cost optimization. A Diet Forge changes that. It's an AI-powered platform with nonlinear ingredient modeling for enzymes and additives, cost per gain and maximum profit optimization, and real-time collaboration like Google Docs for nutrition. Every recommendation is grounded in world-class research, built for modern nutritionists who need more than legacy desktop software can deliver. Work seamlessly with your team and optimize the way modern operations demand. Try dietforge.ai free today. Feed formulation, finally modernized.
So let's dive a little bit into the new brand that you're supporting, which is vetnutritionist.AI, right?
Yeah, so vetnutritionist.AI is something we've been working on in different formats for about 3 or 4 years. We've been really, everything's AI now, but we were pretty early on in some of the work. We had a tool that leveraged the Alexa technology with Vet Assistant AI, with veterinarians, trying to figure out utterances back in the day and all this labeling before large language models really came about. Had some interesting work that we did in that. But Vet Nutritionist AI is an endeavor to do what I've been trying to do multiple times in my career, which is to create a single repository of all foods, not just veterinary therapeutic foods, in one place, standardized to be able to do quick comparisons, sort, filter, really help the veterinarian who has a sea of information that they have to wade through to try to find the right match for a particular patient.
So when you say foods, you're talking about commercial foods that are available, both OTC, which is over the counter, and veterinary therapeutic?
Yeah, and so we've developed using AI technologies with the large language models to be able to go out and extract that data. Then we have used our existing technology and enhanced it, which is really kind of an expert rules-based system, to be able to transform that data so that it's standardized, so that you can make really good comparisons very rapidly, pre-process a lot of that data and create that infrastructure. We're near about 10,000 foods in the database now.
Oh, fantastic. 10,000. That is a huge accomplishment. I have so many questions. So maybe where I will start is, why do you feel that this would be a very valuable tool? And I'm assuming that you're talking about for global veterinary nutritionists to use.
Yeah, so we definitely are focused on the U.S., but it is extracting data from other countries and other places, especially North America. Since you're in Canada, that's probably relevant to the conversation. But I think where I would step off is that we introduced it, and we're about to launch it actually to vet nutritionists next week. We've been pushing to get it by the end of the year, but we introduced it at a very large meeting for academics in veterinary world in June, and we got a lot of interesting feedback. And one of the pieces of feedback that we got was, when you're making these filtering decisions, how do you define those, filters? How do you define ranges? And that's really the subject of what we were talking about at the beginning of, standardizing, if you will, ranges. And part of what I hope we're going to talk a little bit about is the system we came up with to try to define things more consistently of, is something high, low, without any connotation, right, with that. And I think the analogy I make is that right now, depending on where you train, talking about mentors, talking about regionalism, talking about, maybe your preference for evidence-based nutrition or what you see as the gold standard, we speak in different ways about the same thing. And the analogy I make oftentimes is, at least in the US, the regionalism, if like we talk about a beverage, and you might ask in the South for Coke, you might ask for soda. Where I'm in Northern California, you might say pop, maybe in parts of the Midwest. And those all may mean the same thing. But, if you come and travel and visit me from Atlanta, where there's a mecca for Coca-Cola, and you sit down in a restaurant and say, I like a Coke, they're going to bring you a Coca-Cola, where you might mean, I'd like to know your selection, and you might mean, Dr. Pepper, because you're really big into Texas, where that's a big drink, and you moved to Atlanta, and then you moved to, come and visit in Northern California. And so we have regionalism, we have dialects, and it's okay if you say things a little bit differently. I use the pecan pie. It's Thanksgiving as as we're recording this is coming up in the U.S. And so you might say pecan, you may say pecan. I can't do all the variants, but you'll always get a pecan pie if you're asking for that, but not as I say for the beverage. And so when we as nutritionists use different terms for the same thing, that can create a lot of confusion when you're reviewing literature, when you're trying to talk to a colleague, because then you have to give some type of better understanding of what are you talking about. So if I say something's low fat, am I referring it to maybe we're talking to people in the industry, am I referring as a comparative term to one of my other products? Am I referring to maybe AFCO's definition of what that is? Am I, referencing maybe something that's just above the, requirement that NRC has defined? Maybe if I'm in Europe, is it something else because I'm looking at FDAF? It can be really, is it species specific? I'm talking about a dog, but you're talking about a cat. You can really go down a rabbit hole. Or, they used to say for folks like us who trained at Davis, we're all fat phobes. We're really about fat. And so our level of what low fat is very different than you talk to some folks regionally in maybe the South, or maybe even in the East Coast or the Northeast, or maybe for you guys in Guelph, it can be very different. I know you have another colleague there who trained in Europe. And so, if you come across the pond, as they say, what is your definition of that? So really trying to define that more systematically and consistently. And we can talk more about what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So correct me if I'm wrong then, that what you have done then is done a much more accurate job of defining low to high for every single nutrient listed in AFCO. Let's start there. Of course, you and I appreciate that there's other nutrients that people might be interested in too, but we're really focused on essential nutrients, and those are what the animal needs to survive. I will remind everybody of that. So can you talk a little bit about how you defined low to high? And I couldn't agree more, because you read scientific papers all the time and then you have to go digging. When you say low, what did you mean? And suddenly you're like, actually, that's mod to me, right? So I think this is really important.
Yeah, so we went through a series of kind of iterations, and I have to acknowledge 3 other veterinary nutritionists serve on an advisory board for us, Drs. Murphy, Kurzbard, and Eierman, who have very different training and backgrounds, which I chose for that reason, because I didn't need a Davis perspective. I know what that is, because that's kind of where I live and breathe and have existed in the past, and still live in Davis. But I think where we really struck was initially we're like, well, we could break things up into quartiles. So we thought about that. A lot of times when you think about doing statistics and you think about a bell-shaped curve, you break it into quartiles, and that kind of is a way of doing it. And then we looked at, how that defined a range, and it wasn't enough definition. And where we were looking at minimums. So you brought up AFCO. So AFCO has minimums. It has maximums. But we also thought about, as I brought up earlier, the NRC, and where it has a minimum, or it likes to say recommended allowance, if it's accounting for some determines some degree of digestibility versus a minimum requirement. And then it has safe upper limits, which is like a maximum, right, where we worry about toxicity potentially. And then FDAF has similar, it has minimums and maximums, kind of like AFCO. And so thinking about that, for a lot of nutrients, you do have a minimum, you have a maximum, some you don't have a maximum. So we thought, well, if you divide that into deciles, would that be helpful? And that gives you 10 different kind of ranges, if you will, and then you kind of break within that. So we have things like, lowest, looking at this just above the minimum, and then lower, and then low, and then low moderate, talking about your mod comment, mid moderate, high, higher, and then you kind of, and then I'll scroll over because I've got it in front of me, because these adjectives are really important, but they also need to be defined, and then near highest, and then highest or above the maximum or the safe upper limit. And where we really ran into an interesting debate is, where do you set it if there isn't a defined maximum? Because there's a lot of nutrients we don't have a maximum defined. And so we then started to say, well, let's standardize it by using as a multiple of the minimum. And we said, what's the multiple that we could use? And we went with 4, and it works for most nutrients. And so that gives you a nice numerical calculation to give you very discrete ranges. And then within those ranges, you can talk about those as being, 30 to 40% of the range or 40 to 50% of the range. And it gives you very easily calculatable values. But if you heard what I said, where we're referencing it back to AFCO or NRC or FDAF, you also need to know life stage. You also need to know species. And so when you're defining it, you really have building blocks of, okay, you have this descriptor, you have it referenced to a percent of this range, you have to define what that range is. And then you have, what is your body standard setting that you're using, AFCO, FDAF, NRC. And then you need to have your species and you need to have your life stage. And then that all together gives you a very concrete number. I alluded to the fact that sometimes it doesn't work to use 4. And so there's a handful of exceptions, really nutrient-wise. Those exceptions are very, very minimal. The only essential one that we really came up with is sodium. We came up with a higher multiple, and that's maybe because we're all sodium focused and stuff. We used a 7 because 4 just seemed like it was too restrictive. And part of that is if you look at a lot of the over-the-counter foods and sodium, and then you look at the minimum requirement, 0.2 grams per megacalorie might be where people set the minimum. We can have a debate about that, but let's use that as a nice, easy number to multiply. And if you go to 4 times that at 0.8, that doesn't seem that high. There's lots of products that might be at 1, even up to 2 grams. And so that's why that 7 came about, and it seemed to kind of fit with the data. And then there's non-essential nutrients when you start having this debate about fiber or ratios. And then, ratio really can't have a multiple because you don't need a range. And so you really don't use multiple 1. Water doesn't really need a multiple because you're just going higher moisture. So, but for essential nutrients, that really targets it. For overall, you're looking at about 4 if there isn't anything that's defined. And then, you have also this extrapolation that maybe there isn't a maximum per se, but there is in practice. And what I mean by that is we look at carbohydrate and you think about protein and fat. That's often defined as having minimums for most species and life stages that we're talking about in dogs and cats. And so by extrapolation, there is a maximum amount of carbohydrate, because otherwise, if you go over that, you're going to start creating either a fat or a protein deficiency. So you can derive a maximum without having to use a multiple. So with that system put in place, you start to go, well, my goodness, that's, a lot of different bodies, that's a lot of different species, that's a lot of different life stages, that's 40 nutrients potentially or more, and you end up with 20,000 ranges. And so something that I think I shared with you and what we really have, I've made a spreadsheet that's open source. That's the term that people like to use from software perspective, where you can put in a number and then have it define it for you, because who's going to do all those calculations or wants to do that calculation? And it's been refined already. Had a lot of good feedback from my colleagues. I hope it continues to get refinement. I'm not married to any solution, including this proposed one of this decile system. I just think we need to have one. And so the best way sometimes to develop something is to put something out into the world and then have people critique, because I think it's easier to critique than to create something anew. So you just have to be ready for that feedback.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Very important to consult with all key users and key opinion leaders as well. Okay, so a couple of practicality questions for you. We both come from nutrient requirement background. We like the empirical measurement of nutrients to contribute to first the NRC and then to global regulations. How flexible are you going to be as new information comes out and you learn that range of from minimum requirement to upper safe limit might be different and it most likely every single nutrient. There's not that many empirical estimates of nutrient requirements, so hopefully more will come out and we'll get better refinement. But how do you adjust with your software?
Yeah, so when we put the spreadsheet together, we made like a little sheet of the database. So it's dynamic. And so it pulls up whatever specific requirement range you want. So let's say it's AFCO and that particular species and life stage, and then it automatically calculates the range and it you can change a specific nutrient in that for that spreadsheet, it automatically would change it. And the key with the definition is it's referencing a specific year. So if it's FDAIF, it's not just FDAIF in general, it's 2025 FDAIF, right? And right as I was about to present this, it actually came to fruition. I had to cross-check when I first presented to nutritionists a couple months ago. FDAIF just released their new ranges new document, and I had to make sure that nothing changed. But had it changed, very easy, because you just put a new number in and everything's automatically changes it. And then if you're now trying to describe it in the future, then you go, okay, this is the 2025 versus the 2024. Now, I think we know that we know that this is a challenge, but we're still referencing the 2006 NRC, which is becoming even more dated than maybe it was when it was published, because new information, new knowledge becomes available to us, which is wonderful. But it does mean that there is that inherent need to have it be dynamic.
Yep. You're not the only person on this podcast to bring up that it would be a really great idea to revisit the NRC and update it for everyone, understanding how much work that will be, but it would be a lot of help overall. Great. So understand that and how that will update automatically. Amazing. Now, when I have an idea in my mind about how someone might use this, but tell me how a veterinary nutritionist in practice will use this. How are they going to apply this? Give us a tangible example.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. One is it's not just veterinary nutritionists, right? It's all folks who care about nutrition and that might be able to benefit from this, right? Whether they're veterinary nutritionists, companion animal nutritionists like yourself, someone in research, someone in academia, someone maybe in industry. I think that if we can establish and agree upon a definition, we will benefit from being able to describe things consistently. And that has in and of itself value. But I also think it then helps as we look to, these large data sets. I just referenced that at the beginning, that we have this large data set. How do you go about filtering it in a non-biased and an easily understandable and relatable and communicated way, so that you can really go, okay, I want to see all the foods that may be on the lower fat side that we talked about, or maybe I want to buy higher fat and more energy dense, or maybe I care about protein, or maybe I care about a specific nutrient, copper or phosphorus. It gives us a means by which to be discussing things and filtering things in a way that is consistent. And I think I'll give an analogy to, the metric system. Right? There's all these regional ways to measure things, and, what is a foot or what is this distance? And boy, when you have a lot of different ways of defining that creates chaos, and it can create a lot of confusion. And it doesn't matter what you're measuring. You just want to be able to measure it consistently and communicate that. And there is no connotation. I saw you just take a sip of maybe a beverage, if you're drinking something, sometimes you may want your drink to be hot. Sometimes you may want your drink to be cold. Sometimes you want it to be cool. Sometimes you want it to be warm. But it'd be really helpful if when you say I want a cold beverage, you're not giving something boiling. And if you really want something that, is hot, you're not giving something ice cold, right? And so it really helps us to have a system, a metric, I think is the term you used, that's consistently applied so we get what we're looking for. And some days it may be perfectly fine that it's hot. Some days it may be cold. There's no connotation. I think that's the worry that I think we had among some of my colleagues about this. Oh, if you say something's high or something's low, that will create concern. And absolutely not. And where this, I think, manifested from a while back, my specialty college that we're now a member of, the American College of Veterinary and Internal Medicine, spent like a year trying to define what was low carbohydrate, a single nutrient, a single macronutrient. But what they commingled was they were trying to look at it from the perspective of maybe diabetes management or, looking at weight management. So there was more than just the definition of it. It was then how do you define it in the context of a disease, or condition or a nutritional management strategy. That's not what this is about, right? This is about, okay, we're going to define it. And then you can have a debate, about, okay, this is what we define as low carbohydrate. Is that the right concentration of that nutrient? Maybe it should be moderate. Maybe The descriptor does not give and lend itself to being credence or any significance other than being able to define it. Just like if I say I live a kilometer away, maybe that is good for ease of traffic and getting really quickly here, but we're not debating what a kilometer is.
Yeah. Do you think, Sean, that this will also help really steer claim sets on commercial food? Because you see that use, low or high, high in animal protein is one that is very common. Can we get to better metrics for claim sets? Will these regulatory bodies pick this up and be interested?
I don't know, but I certainly would be hopeful, because I think for the consumer, right, a lot of the regulatory guidance is to not confuse the consumer, right, and to be non-misleading and to be fair in comparisons, or enable them to be empowered. And so I would hope that if we do create some type of standardized system like this, that could be used, so that if you see something that says it's mid, moderate, or high, whatever nutrient you want to be mid or high, that we all know what that means. I think we have a handful of examples of that, and it can be helpful. I think sometimes the regulatory folks trip on themselves at times, trying to define things and make it harder than it needs to be. And I realize that there's a lot of voices and different perspectives, and that's always a challenge. But I do think we should be able to have consistency and not have it be confusing, even for us as nutritionists, because you hand me a label, I have to do usually some back calculation or look at it and really discern what are they stating. And can you imagine the consumer? Or really, are they empowered to be able to do that? And maybe with that is also the discussion of what is the significance of that, right? And that's another discussion, because I think sometimes, to your point about high protein, I did my master's in protein in dogs and requirements and amino acids, and that's an area of strong interest. And I worked at a company that had one of the highest protein diets at one point, and we developed grain-free foods, which were, low carb as well as grain free. That people forget that was the initial thrust of that. And so I think there's a lot of interest in at least macronutrients, but to what benefit, right? And I think we talk about, you referenced that I'm a B Corp, or we work at a B Corp. We think about the environmental impact. Does it really make sense if we talk about protein in our world, about maximizing protein, when we know that that's going to be converted to energy, and it's not going to be used for anabolic pathways or to meet amino acid requirements and stuff? And so if we think about the world's population and the needs for protein, and you see that manifested in interest in vegetarian protein sources, in insect protein sources, because we are putting a lot of pressure on our planet. And so I think the better we can define things and then maybe guide people, that's the second part, and educate them that maybe not in all cases is pushing protein a really good idea. Similarly, pushing fat. We have a lot of animals in a lot of developed countries, if we use that term, that have obesity and overweightedness. And so, maybe fat's great for palatability, and that's a good marketing tool because they eat it readily, and their stool size or the fecal output is small. But that energy density increase certainly lends itself to overeating and excess caloric intake, which, then we think about longevity, which we all want more time with our dogs and cats. That's counter to that. So are we doing any favors with that? So we can have a lot of interesting philosophical discussions about, where do we use this? But I think we should first talk about how do we define things and be consistent with it. That's the starting point. Get the same common language.
Yeah, I think I can't agree more. And I've always approached it as sharing the number. But I see, of course, I'm a research scientist predominantly, so that makes a lot of sense that I'd be possessed with the number. And there's a lot more to it. So I really appreciate this effort to make sure that we're talking a common language. And I love that you included it across the entire sector. We need to be talking about it like this, whether you're a veterinarian in practice or you're a product developer. It would be great if we all understood the language. And I think this is a great idea, Sean. So I commend you for these efforts.
Well, thank you. I mean, I hope it's at least a starting point for a discussion, right? Whether this is the end point we reach or this is the right solution, I don't know. I'm not married to it, but I do think that we, as I said, we have to start somewhere, and then we refine and we iterate, and then we hopefully get to something that we can agree on. Because the option of nothing and being silent, as us with expertise, leads it to lay people who maybe they have good intention, but they don't have the training to really establish this. They're not going to do it. And then it becomes very anecdotal. It becomes very misleading. It becomes more marketing, potentially for folks that might be trying to, have something that they want to sell. And so they have ulterior motives. And I'm not saying that those are bad or those intentions are designed to inherently mislead, but they're more likely, if they're not science or evidence-based or mathematically based, to lend themselves to creep, if you will, or a slippery slope where it can be a little bit more dangerous. And sometimes people, even with the best intentions, don't have the knowledge base to realize the mistakes they're making.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your product. And I hope as you learn more that you'll come back on and tell us how the refinement is going, the consulting is going across all your colleagues and your end users. I think this is quite an interesting technology.
Yeah, I'm really interested. We have about 40,000 veterinarians that use our software. We're going to leverage and we're going to release. And I'm very curious to see how we incorporate this a little bit into vetnutritionist.AI for filtering, how it'll be received, how it refines. My hope is that it leads to more discussions on nutrition. I mean, as nutritionists, I think we think about nutrition more than most folks do, but it is one of those things that, as we talked about obesity or overweightness, has such an impact on longevity. But then if we talk about, just overall health, it's one of the things we do every day that we can impact and improve the health of the dogs and cats that we love so much. And I think that it's a wonderful opportunity and a gift that each of us as nutritionists or folks that may be in development, that we can provide nourishment to these very important beings in our lives.
It's time for our famous three.
At Trow Nutrition, we blend our passion for customer success with our love for pet nutrition, bringing together the art and science of nutrition, ingredients, and blending. We're here to dream with you and help you create standout products. We're here to deliver for you with dry ingredient, premixes, base blends, and specialty blends. And we're 100% dedicated to you with a complete focus on pet nutrition. See what Trow can do for you at trownutritionpets.com.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you don't get off too easy. I have to ask you a few questions before I let you go for the day.
Okay.
So the first thing is, how many dogs and cats do you have?
I recently lost my one dog to cancer, so I do not have currently a dog. Yeah, it's still painful. It's my second dog that I have lost to cancer, and it's been tough. But I am a big dog person. I would love to have a cat, but my wife is extremely allergic. So I get to experience cats when I've been in clinical practice, but I don't have any cats in my life right now.
Well, maybe you need to diversify and maybe you should go go towards bunnies or something now.
Yeah, bunnies are really nice. My wife really wanted to have a chinchilla for a while and have a nice sand bath. And maybe I need to go into the exotic pet world, as they call it,
Yeah, be careful. It's a slippery slope as well.
Yeah, and it can be an interesting one. I had a resident mate who's now retired now from the University of Missouri, Bob Backus. I don't know if you know him, but I remember during his residency, he had a turtle consult he was doing. And it took him 2 weeks to figure out if it was a carnivore, an herbivore, or an omnivore. And he was having to go back. It was a Vietnamese species where it originally came from. And so he's trying to go back, because of Vietnam and the French connection, no movie pun intended with that statement, but he was having to go back to the French literature and getting someone to translate it just to determine. And I laugh, when you think about these exotic species, and we talk about dogs and cats and 20,000 ranges. In some of these species, you're just trying to figure out are they omnivore or carnivore and herbivore. That's where we're at. I mean, this is crazy where we're at in different levels of knowledge about different species.
Yeah, definitely. That's so true. You have to almost just figure out what they're eating in the wild and try to replicate it as the easiest way to kind of approach it.
Yeah.
Okay, second question, because amino acids are the best nutrients. What is your favorite amino acid and why?
So leucine, which is probably one you don't hear too much because my master's was establishing the leucine requirement in dogs. So it was one of the last requirements to be established. And so, one that you work with that much in your career early on. I think in the branch chains are interesting amino acids in general and stuff. So that's why it's near and dear to my heart.
Cool. And it activates mTOR, the most potent activator of protein synthesis. So it's a pretty important little amino acid.
Yeah, it doesn't get a lot of visibility, unfortunately, because it's not usually limiting in anything that we deal with as dog and cat nutrition. Everyone's thinking about methionine and taurine and tryptophan sometimes and lysine, but no, leucine's important too. They're all important, right? They're all essential, as we said.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And last but not least, and something I think our listenership would really like is we have a lot of students that listen as well. And what is your biggest piece of advice for anyone who wants to pursue a career in veterinary nutrition?
Yeah, I think that we started the conversation almost on where we'll end it as well, which is, mentorship and finding a good place where you can work with good people. And it doesn't necessarily just mean in academia. And I alluded to, students and residents I've learned from, or grad students, et cetera. My colleagues that I've had, in industry have taught me a great deal, and I don't want to count them out. And so I think as you look in a career, whether it be in veterinary nutrition as a whole, or just in any career path, find good people doing good work that want to share that knowledge with you. And I think you'll be better for it. And I think that as we get older, a little later in our career, and you look back at that and you have more appreciation for it maybe than you did, to give that back and try to do that yourself. So maybe you're later in career, maybe there's other listeners, not just students. Remember that those folks that, gave you a little bit of a help early on, and give that back. And I think that I heard a story recently that, for professional athletes, one of the toughest transitions is when they're no longer competitive. And what saves them often, if they want to stay in their sport, is to realize that they can be a mentor, or what we call a coach, and they can help people master skills. Maybe their body's not able to do that, but they have this wealth of experience and they have this wealth of knowledge that they can share and pass down. And that can be very, very rewarding, not just obviously or beneficial to the mentee, but also to the mentor. And I think that relationship. So what I would say is, if there's an area of interest that you really are passionate about, whatever that may be, find people that are doing that work, talk to them. They may not have a position for you, but they can steer you to the person who does, or they could give you some very valuable guidance as you try to progress in your career and pursue your passion and make the world a little better. And sooner than you realize, you might be that mentor and no longer that mentee.
Absolutely. Great advice, Sean. Well, that concludes another episode of the Pet Food Science Podcast, presented by Wisenetics. Thank you for joining us today. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to stay updated on future episodes. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review, because your feedback is invaluable. Until next time, this is Kate Shoveler signing off for the Pet Food Science Podcast.